Someone you love is going to die, you already know this. And somewhere in your body, right now, there is a system that has been preparing you for that moment for hundreds of thousands of years. Not to protect you from grief, not to numb the pain, but to make you do something very specific with the body. Something your ancestors did so consistently, so universally, that it became one of the oldest human behaviors ever recorded. And when you find out what it was, you will never think about death the same way again. You probably think of a funeral as a cultural tradition, a ceremony. Something passed down through religion or family or geography. But grief researcher Thomas Attig, who has spent decades studying how humans process loss, argues something far older is at work. He says mourning behaviors are not learned. They are ancient operating instructions, encoded, running in the background every time someone close to you disappears from the world. Here is what those instructions actually looked like. Go back roughly 300,000 years, before cities, before writing. Before any religion you would recognize. A band of early humans is moving across what is now southern Africa. One of them dies. And instead of leaving the body and moving on, which would have been the logical, survival-driven thing to do, they stop. They dig. They place the body carefully inside the earth. They cover it with ochre, a red mineral pigment. And then, according to archaeological evidence uncovered at a site called Border Cave, they place a shell pendant beside the skull. Someone made that pendant, someone put it there. That is not survival behavior. That is something else entirely. Paleoanthropologist Francesco Derrico, one of the leading researchers on early symbolic behavior, has argued that this kind of deliberate burial does not just tell us how ancient humans disposed of the dead. It tells us they had a concept of the dead as a category distinct from the living. That the person who had died was still in some meaningful sense a person, worth honoring, worth adorning. Worth placing something beautiful beside as the earth closed over them. Your ancestors were not just surviving, they were mourning. But here is where it gets strange. Because across the ancient world, across cultures that had zero contact with each other, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and mountain and desert, the rituals around death were not random. They were remarkably, almost suspiciously, consistent. And the patterns they share reveal something about what your brain is actually doing when it refuses to let go. In the Shanidar cave in what is now northern Iraq, a Neanderthal burial was discovered in 1960 by archaeologist Ralph Solke. Around the skeleton, the soil contained dense concentrations of pollen from at least 8 different flowering plants. Solke proposed that flowers had been placed on the body before burial. That a creature we tend to picture as grunting and primitive had been laid to rest in a bed of wildflowers. The interpretation has been debated since. But what no one debates is the deliberateness of the burial. The body was placed. The position was intentional. The grave was not an accident. Across the planet, in sites from Spain to Indonesia to the Australian outback, the same pattern appears. Bodies arranged, objects placed. Red ochre spread across bones and skin. These are not independent inventions. They are the same impulse, surfacing again and again across the entire span of human prehistory, because the impulse itself is biological. Here is what your brain is actually doing. When someone central to your life dies, your nervous system does not immediately update. It keeps expecting that person, it keeps scanning for them. Neuroscientist and grief researcher Mary Frances O'Connor, whose book The Grieving Brain maps what actually happens inside the skull during loss, has found that the brain literally searches for the missing person the way it would search for any important resource: food, water, safety. The person you loved was categorized by your brain as essential to survival, and now the survival system keeps asking, where are they? Ancient ritual was the answer to that question. When your ancestor dug a grave, they were not just disposing of remains. They were giving the brain a location, a place to send the grief. A physical site where the answer to where are they had a coordinate: the body is here. Here in this ground under this rock beside this river. This is where you come to speak to them. This is the address of your loss. Every grave is a map the brain drew for itself. And the objects placed inside those graves were not superstition. Or rather, they were not only superstition. They were extensions of the relationship. When ancient humans buried someone with their tools, their jewelry, their food, their weapons, they were doing something your nervous system still does involuntarily today. They were maintaining the bond. They were refusing, on a deep cellular level, to let the relationship simply end because the person's body had stopped working. Continuing bonds theory, developed by grief researcher class and colleagues in the 1990s. Overturned decades of psychological wisdom that said healthy grieving meant detachment, moving on, letting go. The ancient humans already knew the truth. The goal of mourning was never to forget, it was to transform. To change the form of the relationship from physical to something else. Something that could survive death. And so the rituals became elaborate. Not because grief made people irrational, but because grief demanded structure. It demanded something to do with the body. Something to do with the hands. Something that turned the unbearable fact of death into a sequence of actions that gave the loss a shape. In ancient Egypt, that sequence took 70 days and involved the removal and preservation of organs, the wrapping of linen, the recitation of spells, and the placement of specific objects in specific positions, chosen to mirror the journey of the soul through the underworld. The detail is almost incomprehensible. But the instinct underneath, it is the same one that made a Neanderthal 60,000 years ago arrange a body facing east. Point the dead toward the rising sun. Give them something to wake to. Your ancestors across nearly every culture on Earth developed some version of this. The specific imagery changed, the theology changed. But the structure of mourning was always the same. Acknowledgement, action, placement, ongoing relationship. The body must be seen. Something must be done to it, it must be given a location. And then, crucially, it must be visited, spoken to. Remembered not once but repeatedly across the seasons and the years. In Japan, the tradition of Obon sets aside specific days each year for ancestral spirits to return. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos covers entire cemeteries in marigolds and photographs, and the favorite foods of the dead. In West Africa, the Akan people believe the soul of the deceased becomes an ancestor who actively participates in the lives of the living. In ancient Rome, families held a feast at the grave on the birthday of the deceased every year without exception. These are not coincidences. These are convergent solutions to the same biological problem. The brain that loved someone cannot simply stop. It needs somewhere to put that love. The ritual is the container. And here is the counterintuitive truth that modern Western death culture has almost entirely discarded. The ancient way of grieving was not more primitive. In several important ways, it was more sophisticated. More attuned to what the human nervous system actually needs, the modern approach, in which the dead are removed quickly, the funeral is brief, the grief is private. And the expectation is that you return to normal within days or weeks is historically bizarre. It is an aberration. A product of industrialization, medicalization, and a cultural discomfort with death that your ancestors would find not just strange, but deeply alarming. Because for most of human history, death was not hidden, the body stayed in the home. The community gathered around it, children saw it, touched it. The process of dying and the process of mourning were communal events, not medical procedures administered out of sight. And the extended mourning rituals, the ones that lasted weeks, months, years, were not signs of pathology. They were the prescribed, socially scaffolded work of rewiring a brain that had organized itself around a person who no longer existed. Grief in the ancient world was not a private malfunction. It was a public practice with a structure, a timeline, a community of witnesses, and a set of actions that gave the devastated nervous system something to do while it slowly, painfully, rebuilt its model of the world. What your ancestors knew without knowing they knew it is that mourning is not the opposite of love. It is love with nowhere left to go, and the ritual is the channel you build to carry it forward. Tonight, if you find yourself unable to let someone go, if you talk to a person who is no longer there, if you visit a grave not because you believe they can hear you but because something in you needs to go anyway, you are not broken. You are not stuck. You are doing exactly what 300,000 years of human evolution prepared you to do. You are standing at the edge of a hole in the earth, placing something beautiful beside someone who mattered and refusing, with every ancient fiber of your being, to pretend that they were nothing. That shell pendant at Border Cave was not superstition. It was the first love letter written to the dead. And in some form, every funeral, every grave, every candle lit in memory of someone gone is the same letter, still being written, still being placed. Still refusing to say that the story is over just because the person left the room.